Hello and welcome to our special broadcast. I'm Parikshit Luthra. It's Judgment Day in the tariff war. US President Donald Trump is all set to unveil a plan to impose tariffs on key trading partners, which is likely to include India. US officials have made it clear that top nations with whom America has a large trade deficit will be the prime target of the tariffs. What does this mean for India? The US runs a trade deficit of $41 billion with India, which ranks 11th in a list topped by China, Mexico and Vietnam. Sources tell CNBC TV 18 that the United States has received a far-reaching offer from India to bring down the average tariff rate. There are one of three ways that this could actually pan out for India. First, tariffs for India could be suspended if India and US reach an agreement on tariff reductions. Number two, progress in India-US trade talks could bring about a mitigation of reciprocal tariffs on India. Thirdly, reciprocal tariffs could be imposed on all nations, including India, without any exceptions whatsoever. Neither Trump or his administration has revealed any details regarding the structure of duties or the countries that will be impacted. However, White House spokesperson has said that the tariffs are likely to come into effect immediately.
My understanding is that the tariff announcement will come tomorrow. They will be effective immediately. And the president has been teasing this for quite some time, as you know. He's talked a lot about April 2nd as Liberation Day in America. It would be taking place today if not for April Fool's Day. But tomorrow will be the day, and he's been talking about it for a while. And as a result, you've seen these companies make commitments to investing right here in the United States.
All right, let's go across to our guest this evening. We're joined by Anup Wadhawan, former Commerce Secretary, Richard Rossow, Senior Advisor at Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Brian Coulton, Chief Economist at Fitch Ratings, with us as well. Brian, let me begin by asking you, it's now a given that tariffs will come into effect immediately. What's your sense on how this is going to impact the corporate sector worldwide, the immediate reaction that you see in global markets once these tariffs kick in?
This is a huge and rapid change in US trade policy that's going to reverberate right around the planet. I don't think anybody back in December thought that Trump would pursue these tariff hikes so aggressively, so quickly, and implement them on such a broad basis. So this is definitely going to take a big chunk out of global growth. I don't think anybody's going to be insulated from it completely. We've downgraded our global growth forecasts from 2.6% to 2.3. We think US growth will slow to about 1.5%. It's been running at about 3% over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's a really big slowdown. We'll see a rise in unemployment, but Europe will also suffer, as will Asia, particularly the global manufacturing export centers in Asia. A lot of which are focused ultimately on providing the US consumer. So this is a huge shock for the world economy.
Right. Before we move on to our other panelists, Brian, what's your view on how this is going to be impacting India? Donald Trump has always highlighted India as a tariff king, and he has recently said that India will give concessions to the US government and the US economy. How do you see this impacting India, or you feel that India will be insulated from the larger global impact?
Well, I mean, talk about reciprocity. We've recently published a detailed report on, how do the tariff rates faced by US exporters in trading partners markets compare with the rates that the US charges on exporters from those countries. And, in the US and India comes out, when you look at the simple average MFN rate charged by US exporters to it, it's about 12.4%. That compares with 3.7% faced by Indian exporters into the US. So that gap is one of the widest amongst the major economies. So clearly, India is highly exposed to a reciprocity justified action from the US. Now, the Indian economy is not that open compared to China, so exports and imports as a share of GDP are not particularly large in India, so that provides some insulation. Exports to the US are not huge either, so in some sense it's less exposed than, say, a country like Vietnam, which has a huge part of its GDP tied up with exposure to the US. But nevertheless, I don't think India's going to be insulated. If India really addresses Trump's focus and brings down the import tariffs aggressively, there'll be a question about, are they just going to do that to the US, or are they going to make a broader attempt at trade liberalization? That will expose domestic firms in India to greater competition. So there's definitely some big risk here, even for the Indian economy, although it's less exposed than many.
Right, that's an important point. Rick, let me get in a view from you. Is it now given that those tariffs will be imposed all across the board? We hear that this is not going to be a product-by-product tariff, but these are broad-brush tariffs that will be announced country-wise.
Yeah, I've heard the same things that you have. There still seems to be a lot of deliberations, even up through yesterday, in terms of what the White House, the specific plan they're going to announce. But every single review that I've ever seen, India comes out at or near the top in terms of countries that are going to be hit by whatever form the tariff rules come out. But I'm not terribly surprised by the announcement. I mean, the United States is India's #1 economic partner by far, the largest source of exports by a significant margin, the largest market for services exports, largest source of FDI. So to hear that India, and driven directly by the Prime Minister's office, as some reporting have come out, is really pushing to make sure that India comes up with a package that accommodates some of the concerns. So I suspect there's a pretty good chance India will get hit immediately, but this drive to get a deal done so that there's a carve-out sooner rather than later. They talked about the fall, but seems to me like we're pretty likely going to have something ready to go in the spring, trying to blunt that. So then the question is, what are the secondary impacts? Is India going to get flooded by exports from all the countries that have seen them lose market access to the United States? Or, are there going to be additional investments and picking up manufacturing in India, because it's going to be one of the few emerging markets that's going to have preferential access to the American market? So I think we'll get this resolved pretty quick. India will get hit immediately. But I think the question of secondary impact is what I'm going to be watching closely for the rest of the year.
All right, you're looking after the secondary impact. Let me go across to Mr. Wadhawan, who has been a close trade negotiator and who looked at the mini trade deal negotiations with the Trump administration in the first term as well. Mr. Wadhawan, it's all going down to the wire. What's your sense as a former trade negotiator? Do you think talks are going on even now to get a pause on those reciprocal tariffs? And what would be the best case scenario for India?
I think those scenarios you mentioned were very relevant. The critical question is which scenario is going to emerge. And I think there are several signals that the most conducive scenario where these reciprocal tariffs are not imposed on India and we do the trade negotiation in good faith and come up quickly with a trade agreement that addresses the ambitions of both sides while guarding against sensitivity. So that appears to be a likely scenario, because I don't see, a reciprocal tariff arrangement being consistent with the trade negotiation. Once those are imposed, then I think countries, including India, will be forced to, weigh their options and react to them. So then it will become two channels, one channel to deal with the reciprocal tariffs and a separate channel to deal with the bilateral trade agreement. And it will just, vitiate things. So my feeling is that, we might not see reciprocal tariffs, being applied on India and the trade negotiation proceeding swiftly. But let's see, it's all in the realm of conjecture. There's so many conjectures. There is some talk about 20% tariffs across all countries. They're talking about some $600 billion in revenue. The other mentions that some countries like India will come up for special attention. So it's all in the realm of conjecture. But, whatever it is, to the extent it's going to be fairly broad-based, it will be a major shock. And the shock will be the worst, on the U.S. economy, because, the U.S. and the rest of the world will end up in a high tariff scenario, whereas the rest of the world within itself will have a low tariff scenario. So, economic activity, which was between US and the rest of the world, will shift into the rest of the world. So in some ways, the impact will be the most on the US economy. And I don't think this kind of a policy will be sustained for too long. Even now, with tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, the impact has been significant on US markets. So doing the same thing on a broader scale across countries, including EU and the other major trading partners of US, in my view, is not sustainable. So I see the impact of that shock, I think, which Brian mentioned, the impact of that shock will be very significant. And it'll be an interesting, empirical case study as to how this sort of a policy can be implemented and sustained. And then, to the extent you have separate tariffs for different countries, you have to have a rules of origin administration across countries. Otherwise, some third country will take advantage of a country which has low tariffs with the US and shift their goods through that country. So it's a very complex, nightmarish administrative arrangement also to implement. So it's a unprecedented development, and it'll be very interesting to see the outcome. And in some ways, it'll be an empirical test for so many, trade principles. And I'm sure, trade economists are going to watch it very, very carefully with a lot of interest. So it's a real-world empirical testing of, trade principles. Let's see what happens.
Right. That's an important point, sir. This will be an empirical test of trade principles. And as veteran investor in India, Ramesh Damani also said, Brian, that this is the US for the first time looking inwards, and you can never defeat economics. At the end of the day, economics and the principles of economics will take precedence no matter what you do. Let me go across back to you, Brian, with a question on a point that Mr. Wadhawan also made. How sustainable is all of this? Do you get a sense that somewhere the Trump administration is realizing that their policies can be inflationary, can lead to a recession, and this may settle down in the next 3 to 4 months? Or do you feel that this is going to be a permanent principle, a permanent weapon in the US toolkit to bring countries to the negotiating table and to get what US wants?
Well, I don't think the market volatility we've seen so far has really knocked them off course much at all. They seem to be pretty immune to that. They talked about no pain, no gain. It will be much better in the long run. So we need to go through a period of economic adjustment. Neither do I think it's about negotiation. I actually think that there's a deep felt view that they need to revive the role of the manufacturing sector in the economy. They look at manufacturing employment as share of total employment. It's gone down year after year. They look at manufacturing gross value added as a share of GDP. That's gone down, and they see that as a problem in itself, and they see the trade deficit as a problem in itself, and they see high tariffs as one of the key tools to address those so-called problems. And so what we've seen emerging from the new US administration is a narrative about import substitution. So instead of satisfying US consumption with imports, even though imports aren't that big relative to many other economies, they want to shift production back to the United States. Now that seems like a pretty medium to long-term restructuring objective rather than something that is temporary and just about putting pressure on other countries to make other policy changes, even sometimes outside the economic sphere. So I don't think this is going to go away, or I don't think it's going to be a big climb down from this anytime soon. Peter Navarro and Trump seem to really believe in this import substitution story. I'm not saying the economics is very soundly based necessarily, but that seems to be how they view it. If you look at the president's 2025 trade policy objectives, they're very, very clear about the need to restructure the US economy to a producer-focused economy rather than a consumer-focused economy. That's not something you can expect to deliver in a few months. And if that's really what you believe you need to do, you're going to have to stick with this. And that's what we think they will probably do.
Right. Rick, as somebody who's a very close watcher of India-US economic relations, how do you think this is going to realign the trade and the business and economic partnership between India and US, which has been growing year on year. Yes, there has been a trade deficit, but, largely we are strategic allies, good friends, a lot of complementarities. But Donald Trump doesn't care for all of this. How do you see the business mood getting realigned as a result of what's happening in the White House?
Well, I think ultimately the economic relationship between the U.S. and India will probably be strengthened to some extent through this, because I think India is one of the countries that's going to come to the table and going to look to make accommodations, including potentially this deal that we're talking about, that'll really open up the aperture. So you wish it wouldn't happen by force. But I think, again, India views this relationship as important enough across the range of measures. And to the United States, of course, India is growing importance as well. I think it's one of the countries that probably this whole process will be net positive. But long term, it adds another pain point in India's mind. Dealing with the United States and heavy reliance on the United States means that as Washington flips and you've got a president like Trump coming in every few years potentially to have to deal with that, so I think in the near term it'll strengthen economic integration between the two. In the longer term, the deeper concerns India has about over-reliance on the United States and the flips and turns you can have on U.S. policy really kind of augments and boosts that. So good in the short and medium term, I think. More dangerous, I think, long term, as it keeps that kernel of concern in India's mind.
Right. We're going to take a short break, but we'll request all our guests to stay with us. We'll be right back on this discussion on the Trump reciprocal tariff strategy. All right, welcome back. You are watching our special broadcast. We still have with us Anup Wadhawan, former Commerce Secretary, Brian Coulton, Chief Economist at Fitch Ratings, and Richard Rossow from CSIS. And we're discussing the Trump reciprocal tariffs, which are going to be announced and will come into effect possibly immediately in the next few hours. Let me go back to Anup Wadhawan at this stage, our former Commerce Secretary. Mr. Wadhawan, today we've got news that India has hiked U.S. crude oil imports by 67% in the month of March. Clearly, Indian refiners are scrambling to buy more U.S. oil and gas. There will be more long-term contracts because of sanctions against Russia. Do you think that somewhere this is going to cut ice with the U.S. administration and may lead to a pause? India may be negotiating a pause to say that, yes, you wanted us to buy more energy. We've already stepped up buying with long-term contracts. This is only going to increase. We are going to be buying more defense equipment. And this makes sense for a complete pause on any reciprocal tariffs till we have a deal.
Yeah, I think that message has already been conveyed for the last, several weeks. India has conveyed that message, commitment to buy more oil, commitment to buy defense equipment, reduction in some duties. I think bourbon and motorcycles duties came down. So, and for the last few days, we've had extensive discussions with Mr. Brendan Lynch, who was here. So I think all these messages must have been conveyed. So I don't think there's any negotiation going on right now or any effort going on right now. All that effort has been made. So let's see now what the outcome of that effort is. And this whole issue of no pain, no gain, you're just discussing that is fine. But then I don't see too much scope for gain in the US economy in a structural sense, even though, there is economic distress at the lower end of the income distribution in the US. The US is technically at full employment. So I don't see the structural space for manufacturing to come in, and the kind of time frame it will take for that structural adjustment to happen, it's going to be involved just pain. I don't see any quick gains even in the medium term. And one thing we have to remember.
I wanted to ask you one more quick question. The reason why I'm just putting this in is on the issue of automobile tariffs. In every trade negotiation, somehow automobile tariffs is highlighted. This makes India the tariff king. It's somehow giving us a bad name in trade negotiations and trade partnerships. And so we're hearing that this is the sense that the Indian government is also feeling, that it is the automobile tariffs coming up over and over again. Do you believe that it is time for India to consider reducing tariffs, be it on electric vehicles, be it on ICE, to a certain extent, and we need to drop those protections which have been there? Currently, yes, there is a big pushback from the Indian domestic industry that please do not reduce tariffs, do not give zero duties to companies like Tesla. But then the government view is that, no, we can reduce tariffs to about 20% or 30%. What do you think would be the right way forward?
No, certainly, I think there is a need for tariff rationalization, and the mechanism that India has adopted for rationalizing tariffs are the free trade agreements. So we have free trade agreements with major industrial nations, Japan, Korea, the whole of ASEAN, and subsequently now, well, Australia is not a major industrial nation, but then with Australia also. So the mechanism to adopt for rationalizing tariffs, on a bilateral basis in particular, is the trade agreement. And that will be the instrument through which, tariffs between India and the US can be rationalized. Otherwise, I think as Brian mentioned, you have to do it on a MFN basis, and that might not help the US. If you lower duties on all motorcycles across the world, it is not necessary that American motorcycles will get imported. So certainly, tariff rationalization is an important area, but we must do it on our own terms as far as the MFN basis is concerned. And as far as America is concerned, we have to do it through the instrument of the trade negotiation. And I think that offers adequate scope for, rationalizing tariffs and addressing all of the US concerns.
Right. My final question to Brian as well. Now, Brian, as you said, clearly Donald Trump's policy for import substitution, manufacturing America, is a mid to long-term policy. It's here to stay. Do you see this as now a permanent policy? Because even when we saw the Biden administration taking over from Trump, they did not do away with all of Trump's economic policies. Do you believe there is now going to be continuity in this inward-looking trade policy of America? And is the gainer in all of this going to be China?
I think this is certainly here for the duration of this administration. I don't really see much chance of a moment of enlightenment where they realize they've gone down the wrong track and need to step back. I just don't see it. I don't see it panning out that way. This is a pretty deeply held belief that they need to boost the manufacturing sector. As for China, I don't see how we can say that this is really going to help China, because he's already raised the tariff rate on China by 20 percentage points, almost over twice as aggressive as he managed in the whole of the first term. Remember, it was just a bilateral US-China trade war in his first term, but even compared to that, this is twice as aggressive already on China. Our assumption is that the tariff rate on China goes to something like 35%. It's already at 30%. We think there's more to come, and I don't think there's much comparison with the Biden approach, really. I mean, although he didn't unwind the China tariffs that Trump had put in place, I mean, there are a few things on electric vehicles, but nothing like this. This is completely off the charts in terms of this surge in the US tariff rate. Completely off the charts.
Right. And Rick, coming to you, do you feel encouraged about the prospects of trade in certain product lines as a result of the reciprocal tariffs and eventually the signing of the bilateral trade agreement by September, October this year? Are you encouraged about some sectors which could get a boost in the trading partnership?
Yeah, I think overall, India's drive to have domestic manufacturing and the Trump administration focus on Make America Great Again, if we really do not just sign the deal, but you get to the granular level and you think about what are the areas where the United States could export a lot more capital equipment that would help India boost, in areas where they announced PLI programs, things like that, input goods, intermediate goods, things like that. There's a great cataloging, I think, that could be done about what we could do right now. It's kind of knee-jerk. Like, we know India, the government is the primary purchaser of oil and gas and defense materials. So when we talk about offsetting that apart from customs duties, those are the things that the government of India can control. But there's a lot of other sectors where I think the United States could export more that would also have the added benefit of helping Indian manufacturing, and a bit of a win-win. So I do hope that we do focus on areas like that where we improve exports, but India's manufacturing competitiveness would thereby be improved as well.
All right, we've completely run out of time, but Brian and Rick Rossow and Mr. Wadhawan, thank you so much for joining us on this program. It's just a few more hours to go before that major announcement is made in the White House in the Rose Garden, and we'll be tuning in and getting you all the updates on that as well. That's a wrap on this edition of Trump Watch. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.